April 4th, 1944. Kohima Ridge, northeast India. The world is on fire, but here the air is cold and thin. Colonel Hugh Richards stands near the district commissioner's bungalow, the map in his hand trembling, though not from the chill. The ground beneath his feet is shuddering. A deep, percussive thump, thump, thump rolls up the jungle-choked valleys, the sound of Japanese artillery zeroing in. They are no longer a distant threat. They are here. Richards, commander of the scratch force on this lonely ridge, is facing one of the most terrifyingly simple and impossible choices in modern warfare. In front of him, to the east, south, and north, is the entire Japanese 31st Division. 15,000 battle-hardened, fanatical soldiers, led by the aggressive Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato. They are the tip of the imperial spear, the victors of Singapore, Malaya, and Burma. They have not been stopped, let alone defeated, in 2 years. They are here to take this ridge, cross into India, and bring the British Empire to its knees. Behind him, to the west, is a single, narrow, muddy track, the Dimapur-Imphal Road. It is the only road. It is the artery that supplies the main British and Indian forces fighting for their lives 80 miles south at Imphal. If this road is cut, if this ridge falls, Imphal is doomed. And if Imphal falls, the gateway to India, the jewel in the crown, is thrown wide open. This is the choice. Stand and die, or retreat and lose India. Richards looks at the men around him. They are not an army. They are a collection of fragments, a single battalion of British infantry, the 4th Royal West Kents. Parts of the Assam Regiment and the Assam Rifles, a few artillerymen with guns but not enough shells. Convalescents from the hospital, clerks, cooks, drivers. In all, perhaps 1,500 men. Maybe 2,500 if you count every man with a pulse, but only 1,500 who can truly fight. 1,500 men against 15,000. 10 to 1. The shelling gets closer. A cloud of black smoke erupts from the terraced gardens below the bungalow. The Japanese are attacking. Now. This is the story of the Battle of Kohima. It is, perhaps, the most brutal and desperate siege fought by the British Commonwealth in the entire Second World War. It was a battle that would change the course of the war in Asia forever. A clash that marked the high watermark of the Japanese Empire and the beginning of its end. And yet, it has been somehow forgotten, overshadowed by the D-Day landings that would happen just 2 months later, thousands of miles away. It's a battle fought over a piece of ground so small, its most critical point was a simple grass tennis court. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this single, desperate stand matters more than dozens of other, more famous battles. You'll understand why that forgotten tennis court in the mountains of Nagaland is one of the most hallowed and important pieces of ground on Earth. But we can't just jump straight to the tennis court. That's the end of the beginning. Without understanding the context, the sheer, crushing weight of what was at stake, the battle is just numbers. To understand the terror of April 1944, we have to go back to the darkness of 1942. For the British Empire, the war in the East was not a war. It was a catastrophe. Think about the situation. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, but it also launched a simultaneous, terrifyingly efficient blitzkrieg across Southeast Asia. The British, complacent and arrogant, believed their fortresses were impregnable. They were wrong. First, Hong Kong fell. Then, the impenetrable jungles of Malaya were sliced through by Japanese soldiers on bicycles. On February 15th, 1942, the unthinkable happened. The fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops went into captivity in the largest British surrender in history. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an annihilation of prestige. The myth of European invincibility, The very psychological prop that held up the entire British Empire was shattered in a matter of weeks. The wave didn't stop. Japan invaded Burma. Here, the British and Indian forces, ill-equipped, ill-trained for jungle warfare, and with no answer to Japanese tactics, were not just beaten, they were routed. They began the Long Walk, the longest retreat in British military history. From Rangoon, up the spine of Burma, back towards the Indian border, 900 miles. They were bombed from the air, ambushed in the jungle, and stalked by disease. Of the 100,000 civilians who fled with them, perhaps 40,000 died. The army that stumbled back into India in the monsoon of 1942 was a broken, malaria-ridden, and psychologically defeated force. A new, terrifying phrase entered the military lexicon: Burma paralysis. It was the deep, unshakable belief that the Japanese soldier was a superman. An invincible jungle phantom who could march for weeks on a handful of rice, who could see in the dark, and who would rather die than surrender. And now they stood at the gates of India. The Japanese High Command, specifically Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, saw their chance. Mutaguchi was the man who had been instrumental in the Malayan campaign and the capture of Singapore. He was ambitious, ruthless, and he had an obsession: India. He devised a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. It was called Operation You Go. The plan was not, initially, to conquer all of India. It was, on paper, a spoiling attack. The British and Americans were building the Lado Road from India into China to resupply the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. The Allies were also building up forces in the Indian state of Assam, staging for an eventual reconquest of Burma. Mutaguchi's plan was to jump across the border, smash these staging areas, and capture the key city of Imphal. But in Mutaguchi's mind, this was just the start. This is where the stakes pile up. The personal stakes. For the soldiers of the British 14th Army, a mix of British, Indian, and Gurkha troops, this was a battle for survival and revenge. They were the forgotten army, mocked by their own side, stuck at the end of the line in the worst theater of the war. The national stakes. For India, it was existential. Mutaguchi's invasion was to be supported by the Indian National Army, ENA, a force of 40,000 Indian POWs captured in Singapore, led by the charismatic Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose. They believed they were liberating India from British rule. If the Japanese invasion succeeded, it could spark a full-scale anti-British uprising across the subcontinent. This was a civil war wrapped inside a world war. The continental stakes. If India fell, the back door to China was slammed shut for good. The entire Allied strategy in Asia, which depended on keeping China in the war, would collapse. The historical stakes. A Japanese victory would prove that the British Empire was finished. It would hand Asia to a new, far more brutal imperial master. The war could drag on for years, or even be lost. This is what Yugo was. It was a gamble for the fate of Asia, and the entire plan balanced on a single geographic feature. That one, single road. The road from the massive supply base at Dimapur, south to Imphal. It was the only way to supply the 100,000 Allied troops on the Imphal plain. To get to Imphal, Mutaguchi would send his main force, but to cut the road and ensure Imphal's doom, he detached one of his best divisions, the 31st, under General Sato. Their objective was a tiny, insignificant administrative outpost that just happened to sit astride that all-important road. A village called Kohima. Sato's 31st Division crossed the Chindwin River on March 15, 1944. They had 15,000 men and 4,000 oxen. They had no supply lines. Each man carried 3 weeks' rations. The plan was to capture Kohima in a week, then live off the vast British supply dumps they expected to find there. It was a race against time and starvation. They moved with terrifying speed, slipping through the impenetrable 60-mile-wide jungle barrier that the British High Command had insisted was impassable to a division. By April 1st, they were surrounding Imphal. By April 3rd, Sato's division was climbing the hills to Kohima. The British High Command, under General William Slim, was caught flat-footed. They had underestimated the scale, speed, and sheer audacity of the Japanese plan. At Kohima, there was nothing. No fortress, no army, just a supply dump, a hospital, and a few hundred men of the Assam Rifles, and that's exactly what terrified everyone. The road was open. India was open. The only thing standing in the way was a handful of men and one officer who had to decide, in a matter of hours, how to fight an army. There was one man who thought differently. There was one man who did not suffer from Burma paralysis. His name was Colonel Hugh Richards. If you are imagining a swashbuckling hero, a Patton or a Rommel, you are picturing the wrong man. Hugh Richards was not a media personality. He was a professional soldier, a builder of men. He was 50 years old in 1944, a career man who, like many of his generation, had seen the futility of the First World War and dedicated his life to preventing another. He was, in many ways, a product of the very system he was now fighting to save. He was a Raj man, born in India to British parents. He spoke the languages. He understood the customs. Crucially, he did not share the casual, racist contempt that many British officers held for their Indian soldiers. He saw them as professionals, as men, as the bedrock of the army. His early career was solid but unremarkable. He had served, learned his trade, and watched the world change. But his defining characteristic was a quiet, stubborn professionalism. He believed in training, in logistics, and in morale. He was not a man for grand gestures. He was a man who checked the latrines, inspected his men's boots, and ensured his machine guns were sighted correctly. In 1941, he was given command of the 161st Indian Infantry Brigade. This was his instrument. He forged it. The brigade was a typical composite. It included one British battalion, the 4th Queen's Own Royal West Kents, and 2 Indian battalions, the 1st for 1st Punjab and the 4th for 7th Rajputs. In a theater full of broken units and shattered morale, Richards built a team. He trained them relentlessly, not in the parade ground drills of peacetime India, but in the brutal realities of jungle warfare. He taught them to patrol, to ambush, to live in the jungle, and most importantly, not to fear it. He also fought a second battle against the defeatist attitude of the rear echelons. He saw the Japanese for what they were, not supermen, but exceptionally well-trained, motivated soldiers executing a brilliant tactical doctrine. And he concluded that this doctrine could be beaten. How? By not playing their game. The Japanese game was infiltration and encirclement. They would bypass strong points, cut supply lines, and then attack the panicked, isolated garrisons from the rear. This is what had worked in Malaya and Burma. Richard's conclusion was simple. Do not panic. Do not retreat. If you are encircled, you are not trapped. You are now a fortress. You are an anvil. You have forced the enemy to stop, to turn, and to fight your battle on your ground. The encircling force, with its long, tenuous supply lines, becomes the vulnerable one. You just have to hold. This was a revolutionary idea in the Burma theater of 1943. It was the core of the new doctrine being developed by General Slim, the 14th Army's new commander. And Hugh Richards was one of its first and most important disciples. He had setbacks. His brigade was part of the disastrous First Arakan Offensive in 1943, another failed attempt to push back into Burma. But unlike others, Richards and his men came out of it not as a broken unit, but as a seasoned one. They had met the enemy. They had taken a bloody nose, but they had also given one. They learned the most vital lesson of all: the Japanese soldier can be killed. By late 1943, Richards's 161st Brigade was sent to the quiet sector, the Assam region. They were moved to Dimapur, the massive supply base, with one battalion forward in the hills at Kohima. It was supposed to be a rest and refit, but Richards was uneasy. He surveyed the terrain. He saw the absolute, critical importance of that one road. He saw the vulnerability of Kohima. He started to make plans. He started to dig. He quietly, methodically, began to turn the sleepy administrative hill station into a fortress. He sighted machine gun posts. He registered artillery targets. He mapped out fields of fire. He placed his headquarters on Garrison Hill, a knoll that commanded the road. He looked at the district commissioner's bungalow, with its terraced gardens and tennis court, and he didn't see a pleasant retreat. He saw a natural strong point. He did all this against the prevailing wisdom that the Japanese would never, could never, attack here in force. By early 1944, Colonel Hugh Richards had concluded that the impenetrable jungle was a lie, and that if the Japanese ever came, this insignificant ridge must be the place where the British Empire finally turned and fought. He had no idea how soon or how violently his theory would be tested. On March 29, 1944, the quiet sector exploded. The first reports were just rumors. Whispers from Naga tribesmen, frightened refugees. Then, the forward pickets of the Assam Rifles, strung out miles to the east, went silent. General Slim, 80 miles south at Imphal, was already fighting for his life. The main Japanese Yugo offensive had hit him head-on. When he heard that an entire Japanese division was heading for Kohima, the blood must have run cold. He had nothing to send. The 161st Brigade was the only formed unit in the area, and it was moving. This is where the situation becomes truly, horrifyingly impossible. Corps Command, in a panic, had issued a catastrophic order. Believing Kohima was a lost cause, they ordered Richards to pull his main brigade back to Dimapur to protect the supply base. They were writing Kohima off. Richards, on the ground, knew this was suicide. Giving up the Kohima Ridge meant giving the Japanese the high ground. It meant letting them sit astride the road and shell the Dimapur base at their leisure. It meant Imphal was lost. He was now fighting not just the Japanese, but his own high command. This was his audacious gamble. He slow-rolled the order. He played for time, he argued. He said he could hold if they let him. Finally, a compromise was reached, born of pure desperation. Richards would be allowed to leave a stopgap force on the ridge. He was to garrison Kohima. Think about what this meant. He had to decide, right then, who would stay and who would go. It was a death sentence. He chose the 4th Battalion, the Royal West Kents. A single British battalion, about 800 men. To this, he added the men already there, the Assam Rifles, the men from the local depot and hospital. This is the 1,500-man force from our title. It wasn't a brigade. It wasn't an army. It was a cocktail of soldiers, clerks, and walking wounded. And Richards was their commander. His task was to hold the ridge. Let's stack the obstacles. It's a ladder of impossibility. 1. The enemy. 15,000 elite Japanese soldiers, 10-to-1 odds. 2. The terrain. Kohima Ridge is not a fortress. It's a long, 2-mile ridge, like a whale's back. It's impossible to defend it all. The perimeter would have to be small. 3. The perimeter. The only defensible part was the very crest of the hill, an area of about 1,000 by 500 yards. Think of a large golf course. This is the box 1,500 men had to hold. 4. Logistics. Ammo. They had the ammunition on hand, enough for perhaps 3 days of intense fighting. After that, they were a spear and club society. 5. Logistics, food, same, a few days' rations. 6. Logistics, water. This was the fatal flaw. The main water source, a spring, was outside the planned perimeter, down a slope. Holding it would be impossible. They would be entirely dependent on what they could store. 7. Time. The British 2nd Division, the only force that could relieve them, was fighting in the Arakan, hundreds of miles away. They were being flown in a desperate emergency airlift to Dimapur. They would not be ready to fight for at least 2 weeks. Richards had to hold for 14 days, with 3 days of ammo, with no water, surrounded, against 10-to-1 odds. Most commanders would have called it impossible. They would have retreated, saved their men, and given up the ridge. But Richards knew the stakes. He was risking his reputation, his career, and the lives of all 1,500 of those men. His plan was audacious precisely because it was so simple. We will not move. He laid out the perimeter. Garrison Hill for his HQ. The Royal West Kents would hold the vital northern and eastern faces, including the DC's bungalow and the tennis court. The Assam Rifles would hold the southern end. The hospital, on a lower slope called Dis Hill, would be a separate strong point. He gave the order, dig. Dig as you have never dug before. Dig for your lives. This was an enormous gamble. He was betting 1,500 lives that the British 2nd Division could get there in time. He was betting that 1,500 men in deep trenches could hold off 15,000. He was betting that his revolutionary, untested anvil theory would actually work. He was betting the fate of India on a single muddy hill. The time for planning was over. The time for digging was over. April 4th, 1944. The first Japanese shells scream overhead. The ground shakes. This is not a probe. This is the main event. Sato, the Japanese commander, had expected to walk into Kohima. He was furious. He had lost a day. He unleashed his artillery. For 24 hours, shells rained down on the tiny perimeter. The noise was indescribable, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated in the chest and shattered the nerves. Trenches collapsed, trees were reduced to blackened stumps. The hospital building was hit and then hit again. April 5th, the first infantry assault. The Japanese came just as Richards had expected. Not in clumsy World War I-style waves, but in small, infiltrating groups. They used the jungle, the terrain, the hundreds of shell craters. They were ghosts in the smoke. They hit the southern end of the ridge first, swarming the positions of the Assam Rifles. The fighting was immediate, personal, and savage. Bayonets, knives, and grenades. The Assam Rifles, outnumbered, were pushed back. Richards, in his bunker on Garrison Hill, received the reports. The line was bending. He had one last card to play. The 161st Brigade had been pulled back to Dimapur, but he had one company of the Royal West Kents still with him. He had held them as his last reserve. He released them. The Kents charged, screaming into the melee. They hit the Japanese flank and in a furious counterattack retook the lost ground. The line held. For now, the pacing of the battle was set. It was a relentless cycle. Day. The Japanese artillery would pound the ridge into dust, shell after shell, for hours. The air was unbreathable, a toxic mix of cordite and pulverized earth. Men huddled in their trenches, hands over their heads, praying. Night. The Japanese infantry would attack. They would use the darkness, crawling forward, trying to find a gap. Flares would go up, revealing fleeting, terrifying images of running men, and the machine guns would open up. Then the grenade duels would start. April 6th. Sato realized his frontal assaults weren't working. He switched tactics. He would strangle the garrison. He sent his men around the ridge, completely encircling it. They dug in on the other side, on the slopes overlooking the road. The siege had begun. Kohima, was now an island. April 7th. The Japanese launched a coordinated attack on two key points: the hospital area, Dis Hill, and the DC's bungalow. The attack on the hospital was a precursor of the horror to come. The position was slightly isolated from the main ridge. The Japanese swarmed it. The walking wounded, nurses, and a handful of defenders fought from room to room. It was a massacre. The Japanese, enraged, showed no mercy. The wounded were bayoneted in their beds. Richards received the news. Dis Hill had fallen. The perimeter was shrinking. April 8th, the focus shifted. Sato had to take the rest of the ridge to clear the road. He aimed his attack at the northern end of the position, a knoll held by the Royal West Kents, a position dominated by the district commissioner's bungalow and its garden and its tennis court. The Japanese came in force. They overran the forward positions. They captured the bungalow itself. By April 9th, the Yamaiti situation was a nightmare. The British held the terraced gardens below the bungalow. The Japanese held the bungalow above them. The dividing line between the two most powerful empires in Asia, the line that would decide the fate of India, was no longer a border. It was no longer a river. It was the white-taped line of a grass tennis court. The time had come. The battle for the tennis court was about to begin. This is the part of the story that defies belief. If you wrote it in a novel, it would be rejected as too absurd. The battlefield was now 50 yards wide. The men of the 4th Royal West Kents were dug in along the lower edge of the court, using the terraced bank as a giant trench. The Japanese were 25 yards away, dug in on the other side. They were so close, they could hear each other whispering. They could hear each other cocking their rifles. The fighting that followed for the next 10 days was not war as you imagine it. It was not strategy. It was medieval. It was a primitive, fist-to-guts brawl. Let's use the zoom lens. Wide shot, Kohima Ridge is a pillar of smoke. From the air, the 1,000-yard perimeter looks like a festering wound, pockmarked by 10,000 shells. Surrounding it, a ring of 15,000 Japanese. Beyond them, the jungle. Beyond that, the world. Medium shot. Colonel Richards is in his command bunker on Garrison Hill. A shell has just hit the entrance, burying 2 of his staff. The air is thick with dust, the smell of sweat and cordite. The radio is dead. He is completely blind. His only contact with his men is via runners, soldiers who have to sprint across open ground under machine gun fire to deliver a single message. His job now is not to command, but to endure, to be a fixed point of calm in the hurricane. He moves from trench to trench, helmet on, a pistol at his hip, speaking to the men. His presence alone is what holds the line. "Hold on, lads. Just one more day. The 2nd Division is coming." Tight shot. A 20-year-old private from Kent, let's call him Harry, is in a foxhole at the edge of the tennis court. He has not slept in 5 days. He is filthy, caked in mud, blood, and excrement. His rifle is hot to the touch. He has 3 bullets left. His water bottle is empty. He is staring at the service line. He watches as a small pineapple-shaped object arcs through the air. Grenade! He ducks. The explosion showers him with dirt. This is the pacing. The battle becomes a relentless, minute-by-minute grind. The Japanese attack the tennis court. They charge. The Kents meet them with the last of their bullets. The Kents are pushed back. The Japanese take the service line. The Kents' non-commissioned officers, the sergeants and corporals, take over. "Fix bayonets!" They counterattack, a screaming, desperate lunge across the court. They retake the line. They fall back into their holes, exhausted. Then the Japanese mortars start. This happens 3, 4, 5 times a day. April 12th, the water runs out. The last of the storage tanks is hit by a shell. Men start drinking from the radiators of wrecked jeeps. They start drinking their own urine. Thirst becomes a worse enemy than the Japanese. It's a dry, rasping, maddening torture. April 13th. And then it got worse. The Japanese bring up their 75mm guns, not for artillery, but for direct fire. They wheel them to point-blank range, 100 yards away, and fire them like rifles, straight into the British trenches. The effect is devastating. Bunkers, trenches, and men simply disappear. This is the moment. This is the knife's edge. This is where heroes are forged. A 26-year-old soldier, Lance Corporal John Pennington Harmon, sees his post being annihilated by a Japanese machine gun. He's had enough. He grabs a rifle. He charges. Alone. He runs up the slope, straight at the machine gun nest. He jumps in, kills the crew. He picks up the machine gun, and he charges the next one. He is cut down, but the guns are silent. Harman would be awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. This is the kind of courage it took. Individual acts of suicidal bravery just to buy one more hour. April 15th. The RAF tries to help. Dakotas fly over, dropping supplies, but the perimeter is too small. The wind is wrong. The men watch in agony as 90% of the life-saving water, ammunition, and food drifts slowly down into Japanese hands. It's a false summit. Hope delivered from the sky, stolen before their eyes. Sato is enraged. His men are starving. His one-week operation is now on day 11. He orders one final massive assault. April 17th. Night. The Japanese form up. They have new tactics. They tie explosives to long bamboo poles. They will crawl forward and detonate them inside the British trenches. The attack begins. It is the battle's climax. All along the perimeter, the Japanese attack at once. The fighting at the tennis court becomes a heaving, chaotic mass of men. It is pitch black. The only light is from grenade flashes and muzzle blasts. You can't tell friend from foe. It's just stabbing, shooting, screaming. The line breaks. The Japanese are in. They swarm over the tennis court and up the slope toward Garrison Hill. This is the end. The perimeter is breached. Richards grabs his pistol, his staff, the clerks, the radio operators, they all grab rifles. They form the last line, and then a new sound. A deep rumbling crump. Crump, crump. This is not the sharp, high-explosive crack of the Japanese guns. This is big, this is deep, and it's landing behind the Japanese. It's the sound of British 25-pounder field guns. It's the sound of the 2nd Division. The relief force has arrived. The shells from the relieving army, firing from the road below, rain down on the Japanese rear, cutting off the assault. The Japanese attackers, caught between the garrison's last stand and the new artillery, are annihilated. April 18th. Dawn. The survivors on the ridge, skeletal, hollow-eyed, look down the road. They see a tank, an M3 lead tank, with a British roundel on its side, is grinding its way up the road. The siege is broken. The battle is not over. But the stand, the impossible 16-day stand, is the first soldiers of the British 2nd Division who reached the ridge could not believe what they saw. They were veterans, men who had fought in North Africa. They thought they had seen war. They had seen nothing like this. The ridge was not a battlefield. It was an abattoir. The 1,000-yard perimeter was a cratered, lunar landscape, stripped of all vegetation. The air was thick with the smell of 16 days of human existence in one place. Cordite, excrement, and, overwhelming all of it, the sweet, sickly stench of death. Thousands of bodies, British and Japanese, lay in the open, rotting in the sun. In some places, they were piled 3 deep, the product of repeated failed banzai charges. The tennis court was unrecognizable, its white lines long since obliterated. The ground churned into a bloody, gray-green mud. The 1,500 defenders were not soldiers. They were ghosts, Men who had not eaten in days, who were dehydrated to the point of collapse, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes staring, haunted. The human cost was staggering. The garrison, of the 1,500-man force, they had suffered over 500 casualties, killed or wounded, a catastrophic loss rate. The Japanese. General Sato's 31st Division had been savaged. In the 16-day siege alone, they had lost nearly 4,000 men, shattered against the rock of the ridge. Each of those numbers represents a person. A 19-year-old from London, a 22-year-old from a village in Assam, a 25-year-old farmer from Kyoto. The ground was saturated with their courage and their blood. There was no celebration. There was only a stunned, exhausted silence. The relieving soldiers, tough men, wept as they handed their water bottles and cigarettes to the survivors. Hugh Richards, his face black with grime, his uniform torn, formally handed over command of the sector. He had done his job. He had held the ridge. The immediate strategic consequence was profound. General Sato was trapped. He had failed to take Kohima. He had failed to capture the British supplies. His men were now starving, and he was now caught in a vice. The British 2nd Division was in front of him, and the battered but unbroken Kohima garrison was behind him. His division, the proud 31st, was no longer an attacking force. It was a dying one. But the true significance of the 16-day stand went far beyond the immediate celebrations, far beyond the relief of a few hundred shattered men. The Battle of Kohima and the subsequent Battle of Imphal changed the world. Let's break down the ripple effects from smallest to largest. First, the tactical impact. By holding the ridge, Richard's 1,500 men accomplished exactly what he had gambled they would. They became the anvil. They stopped Sato's division dead. They forced the Japanese to fight a brutal, attritional battle, a battle they could not win and could not afford. Most importantly, they bought 16 priceless days for the British 2nd Division to arrive. Second, the strategic impact. The stand at Kohima doomed the entire Yugo offensive. Because Kohima held, the road to Imphal was never truly cut. Because Kohima held, General Slim could fight the main battle at Imphal on his own terms. Sato's failure to take the ridge and his subsequent disastrous decision to try and besiege it was the single greatest Japanese error of the campaign. His division, which was supposed to be the hammer, was instead broken on the anvil. Third, the theater-level impact. This was the turning point, the Stalingrad of the E8. This is not hyperbole. It is fact. General Slim, the 14th Army's commander, would later write, "You can draw a line and say, here the Japanese march was halted." That line was at Kohima. Before this battle, the Japanese army in Asia was an invincible advancing tide. After this battle, they were in a full, desperate, and irreversible retreat. The 14th Army, the Forgotten Army, began a 2-year offensive that would not stop until they had retaken all of Burma. Fourth, the historical trajectory. The Battle of Kohima-Imphal was the greatest land defeat in Japanese history. Up to that point, they committed 85,000 men to the invasion of India. They suffered 55,000 casualties. Think about that number. It's a level of destruction from which no army can recover. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an annihilation. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility forever. It proved that, in the jungle, on their own terms, the British and Indian soldier could not just match the Japanese, they could destroy him. It also proved the loyalty and courage of the Indian army. In a war where Japan was trying to spark a war of liberation, the Indian soldier stood shoulder to shoulder with the British. This loyalty, this shared sacrifice, would ironically and powerfully pave the way for India's independence just 3 years later. If Kohima had fallen, and it should have fallen, Sato would have taken Dimapur. The 100,000 men at Imphal would have been forced to surrender. The Japanese, with the INA, would have been in India. The war in Asia could have dragged on for years, costing millions more lives. That 16-day stand wasn't just about a road. It was about everything. So, why? Why has an event of this magnitude, a battle that military historians like Robert Lyman have called one of the greatest battles of World War II, and Britain's Gettysburg, faded from popular memory? There are several clear, rational reasons. 1. Overshadowed by D-Day, the most obvious reason. The siege of Kohima was broken in late April. The final clearing of the Japanese from the rest of the ridge, a separate, equally bloody battle, took until early June. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. The entire world's attention, media, politicians, the public, snapped to Europe. The war in the far-off jungle was, once again, forgotten. 2. Geographic distance. This was the Burma campaign. It was fought in a place most people in Britain or America couldn't find on a map. It was a sideshow in the public imagination, despite being the largest land campaign fought by the Western Allies. 3. The wrong army. The 14th Army was a Commonwealth army. It was overwhelmingly Indian. Post-war, as the British Empire was dissolving, this victory was politically complex. Britain was focused on its European narrative. The newly independent India, understandably, had little interest in celebrating a victory won for the British Raj. 4. Complexity. The Burma campaign is notoriously difficult to understand. It's a sprawling, confusing, multi-front war with no clear single objective like Berlin. Kohima and Imphal are often lumped together, their individual, critical importance lost in the muddle. 5. No great man narrative. Unlike the war in Europe, Patton, Monty, Rommel, or the Pacific, MacArthur, the Burma campaign was led by General Slim. He was, perhaps, the greatest British general of the war, but he was quiet, professional, and beloved by his men, not a media superstar. The hero of Kohima, Colonel Hugh Richards, was a professional, not a self-promoter. 6. The nature of the foe. The Japanese soldier was an enigma. He fought with a suicidal bravery that Western audiences found hard to comprehend. It was easier to focus on the known evil of the Nazis than the alien fanaticism of the Japanese. Despite all these factors, military historians have never forgotten. They know that this was the decisive moment. This was where the rot in the Japanese army, the hubris of its commanders, and the starvation of its men finally met an immovable object. That object was 1,500 men, under one officer, on one hill. In the end, the Battle of Kohima deserves to be remembered. It deserves its place alongside Stalingrad, Midway, and El Alamein as one of the true, definitive turning points of the Second World War. When you visit Kohima today, the ridge is quiet. The DC's bungalow is gone. But Garrison Hill is now an immaculate Commonwealth War cemetery. The graves of 1,420 men lie in terraces on the exact ground they died to defend. And the tennis court is still there. Its lines have been permanently marked in white stone. At the northern end, a simple, carved memorial stands. It has become one of the most famous epitaphs in the world. It was written by a second-generation officer, John Maxwell Edmonds, and it speaks for the dead. When you go home, tell them of us and say for your tomorrow we gave our today. Remember the date, April 4th, 1944. Remember the ridge, Kohima. Remember the men, 1,500 soldiers, clerks, cooks, and convalescents. Remember the officer, Colonel Hugh Richards, the man who saw the stakes and refused to blink. Remember that for 16 days they stood against 15,000. They stood without water, without food, and, in the end, almost without hope. They stood, and they did not break. The story of Kohima is a reminder of a universal principle, that sometimes, in the great impersonal tide of history, the actions of a few in a very small place can matter enormously. They can change the world. This is our history, and it's worth remembering.